The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss, welcoming you to the 7th video in our series of video analyses of the orchestration of Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition by Ravel, but actually only the 4th movement. There have been so many fragments and introductions and explanations up to now that it's kind of funny that this is just movement 4, Bydlo, which means oxen in Polish. This apparently is a musical depiction of a painting Hartmann did of an ox cart with enormous wheels being hauled by not one, but several oxen. Very few of Hartmann's paintings actually survive in general, not just to mention ones which would be relevant to this particular series of musical impressions. So, everybody uses the Picasso painting of an ox cart, which I have also done at the beginning of this video. And truth to tell, none of the Hartmann paintings and sketches that I've used so far to go along to these videos are the actual paintings that Mussorgsky was inspired by, but they are pretty cool nonetheless. It's just a shame that we don't have them because they made such a huge impression on Mussorgsky that I'm sure that they had quite an evocative quality to them. All we can do is just look at the music and see what kind of images that the paintings might have evoked. And in this case, we get a sense of huge lumbering. Now, there's going to be a big dynamic difference between this piano score and Ravel's orchestration. And the biggest difference is that it starts fortissimo in the piano score, as if we are face to face with this ox cart. And then towards the end, as we'll see on the next page, things sort of die away as if we are watching the ox cart and its oxen disappear into the distance. However, as we'll see, Ravel wants the ox cart to approach you and then go by you and then disappear into the distance, which I think is a good choice because it doesn't overuse the titanic plodding energy of this piece. So if we look at it, this is Mussorgsky at his stompiest, and this approach will be quite reminiscent to listeners of Prokofiev, although, once again, admittedly, it was way before Prokofiev. Very, very firm, solid octaves in a fifth and octaves in a third. Mainly just keeping this D sharp going as a pedal in the middle. Then, of course, when the harmony changes, the strategies change. But the main thing is to keep that huge sense of solidity going, and keeping the D sharp in the middle helps that. And, of course, if D sharp is our fifth, we are still in 5 sharps. We just can't seem to break out of 5 sharps yet. And that's fine. This is just the way that Mussorgsky heard these pieces and where he wanted to put them. And let me just say something here as a pianist, and that is, once you have a solid sense of technique and every key is about the same difficulty in terms of reading, then black keys are actually your friend. They are your landmark. They can be your lifesaver. Those little keys sticking up out of the keyboard provide really great landmarks and places for you to cling on to over a sea of white keys. So one shouldn't be surprised that Chopin and Liszt, and in this case Mussorgsky, have all scored pieces with lots and lots of black keys. It's not an attempt to be showy or to say, hey, in order to be up to our level, you have to play in a lot of black keys. It's actually the black keys that are making things easier. In some cases, there are a lot of passages where there are rapid-fire runs through black keys and so on and so forth that might be a little easier on white keys. But in terms of overall landscape and the ease of not losing your way, then I would say that keys that have black keys in them are probably more comfortable in the long run. And of course, if you don't have any sight at all, they're actually preferred keys. For instance, Hit the Road Jack by Ray Charles is in the same exact key as this, G sharp minor, and that is a very comfortable place where you can play and not get lost if you cannot look at the keyboard. So don't think of these multiple sharp and multiple flat keys as necessarily being a drawback in any way. It's just sometimes they're difficult to negotiate for the players. And in the case of Mussorgsky, sometimes we see a movement to the right resulting in double sharps, but often we see it to the left resulting in naturals. So it's not necessarily always a bad thing. So let's get back to the orchestration. We were talking about the stompiness, and that is something that pretty much maintains its presence throughout the entire piece. Though, after a while, you see that there are these little climbing phrases that help to lighten the accompaniment, but then balancing that, there are other passages where not only do you have stomping continuing on with the eighth notes, but you have very solid quarter notes to drag things back before they get too light, if that could be called light. So what are all of those stompy notes supporting? And in this case, it is a very forceful melody in the bass clef. Think about that now, all right? What kind of melody position would you need on a piano to compete with all this stompiness? So all impressionism, all programmatic considerations aside, right? Let's say that we just wanted to create like a Chopin etude that has absolutely zero programmatic qualities to it. And we had all of this stompiness going on in the left hand. Really, picking a lower note that could also get a huge amount of projection would be a great position to start a melody. And that is what's going on here. So it's kind of ergonomically balanced. Even though things reach all the way up to a high G sharp over the bass staff, it still really stays around that area of bass clef. So you could think about this as covering the tenor register to a degree, right? Which I would think about as being the same exact range from D or D sharp all the way up to G or G sharp. That is like the sweet spot of the tenor register. So that continues on quite a bit, just this simple single note. Then, when the left hand gets especially brutal and thick, we have a chordal second subject coming in here. And that dies off a little bit in the middle, and then hits a crescendo and gets really, really big here with sforzando accents. And you'll see this also in the orchestration. Here's a place where things get really big. Especially here, con tutta forza, so with all force. We're really digging in here. And this is the return of our melody. Bum, 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 bum. So obviously, this is a really choice section for the orchestra to do a massive tutti. Finally, things die back down, diminuendo, and we have a repeat of the simplicity of the opening melody with just a single line, but softer. So if we have this diminuendo here, which was probably added by Rimsky-Korsakov, since he's put it in brackets, then this provides the temptation right here for Ravel to see the opening as perhaps a softer beginning than Mussorgsky originally marked. And that makes sense as well, because if you were to really have everybody playing hugely here, you might just end up swamping your soloist, right? If the orchestra is surging around them and going crazy with their fortissimo blasting from below, what instrument would be able to compete with them here, except for, say, maybe a trombone or something? We'll talk about what Ravel chooses in a minute. But let's go ahead and take a look at the next page. And we can see that things actually really die back. Pianissimo, even though we have the extra stompy quarter notes in there. And very similar to the way that Il Vecchio Castello died away, there are little interruptions. So I guess this is the mooing of the cows in the distance. Just barely anything as the stompiness continues on very softly. One last little moo. Then, once again, perdendosi. And we end with a couple of notes, and that is it. So, let's have a listen to that now, and watch for those elements and for the extremely simple construction of this piece. How the single melody is played at the end and at the beginning. Just right off the bat, there's no introduction, and in fact, there's no promenade to this at all, which is kind of refreshing. It did need a break, and that is a judicious choice by Mussorgsky. Then our second subject in the middle here, with all these chords, that provides a little tailing off and then a huge crescendo to a massive section that reintroduces the theme in octaves. It's a very, very simple construction, but it's really effective. So let's have a listen to that in its piano version, and then take a look at what Ravel did with the orchestra. And now for Ravel's orchestration. Let's take a quick look at the orchestra first. 3 flutes, 3 oboes, notice with no auxiliaries of piccolo or English horn. Clarinets in A, bass clarinet once again in A, 2 bassoons and contrabassoon, and 4 horns, plus tuba soloist. Then we've got a little bit of timpani, snare drum, and bass drum, plus one harp and strings. When you consider the sheer weight of this movement, that's actually an unusually small orchestra. There are no heavy brass, and there's no English horn, and yet Ravel manages to achieve some of the heaviest scoring of his whole career in just this one movement. The place to look is right here to understand what's going on for the first episode of this piece. Right there in the lower strings, divisi into two separate staves, muted all the way through, including muted basses, which is pretty rare because basses can really control their timbre to a great degree, within the limitations of their overall timbre, of course. But they can play incredibly softly. They can add or subtract an edge to their tone, depending on where they put their bow in the really wide area between the fingerboard and the bridge, right? So they can get effects that sound muted already if you really need them to. And if they hear the rest of the orchestra playing muted, they can fit right in. But they can sound very cool muted as well. In this case, it works great because we sort of want a limited sound here. That slightly wispy sound as the ox cart is slowly approaching, maybe from out of the kind of marshy smoke hanging on to the road in the early morning. And it's set up extremely simply, just going back and forth between G sharp and B over and over again, just like in the bottom of the left hand. And here we have the fifth of that G sharp, the D sharp, but then going down to the B, and that helps to really drive that B home. Meanwhile, the lower divisi cellos are taking the octave above and dipping down to the D sharp over and over again. Then above them, we've got G sharp up to B. So there are quite a few notes playing that B, and that gives a huge amount of weight to them. On top of that, despite the fact that we are in pianissimo, the notes are marked to be played tenuto, so every note is getting a very long, firm bow to it. Interestingly enough, Ravel is accompanying that entire passage, pretty much note for note on the outside, by legato bassoon family instruments. Right? So contrabassoon is just flowing back and forth under a nice long slur. Same thing with the first bassoon. And interestingly here, the D sharp is just sitting there as a pedal tone, which I think is very charming. It happens several times through this page. Otherwise, the bassoons basically are a replication of what's going on in the left hand. And that's pretty much doubling what's going on in the strings as well. Now, here's a note. Ravel says, remove the mutes one by one up to rehearsal mark 39. So players will just stop playing in order to remove their mutes very subtly, and that way the playing can keep going. And that also gives the passage this sense of growing non-mutedness, which is kind of a nice subtle effect. I'm not sure that it makes a huge difference to the ear, but it does make a subtle difference psychologically, I feel, and helps this music to grow without actually marking any kind of crescendo. So the notes will appear to become firmer and fuller in resonance, without any kind of hairpin or anything else. Added along to this are a couple of subtle notes in the harp. Now they're marked pianissimo and piano, but if the harpist wants them to be heard at all, this very low A and very, very low F flat, then they will have to play them more like mezzo forte or even forte for them to stand out. But they will come through so long as the tenuto bow strokes are not too aggressive. But nobody's paying attention to this. And in fact, people who are listening to this will be impressed by this surging, stomping, though softer at first, accompaniment. Notice poco a poco crescendo, right? So we're already assuming that this is going to get bigger, but it will just naturally get bigger as well as the mutes are removed. What everybody's focusing on is this tuba solo. Now, this is perfectly possible as a solo on just a standard F tuba. And people have hypothesized that this was to be played on a lighter B-flat tuba that Ravel would have had access to in France. However, I'm not so sure that that B-flat tuba would have been able to reach some of the profoundly low notes that we see in other movements. So I think that he was probably intending this to be played by just a standard tuba that might have been floating around for bigger operatic works and bigger symphonic works and so on, rather than any lighter model. However, knowing, even back then, as a great craft orchestrator, that tuba players bring whatever model they need, and they'll bring several models if they need them, Ravel was probably thinking that the tuba player might well play this on a tenor tuba or a smaller tuba anyways. If we take a look at the instrument that our collaborating orchestra has chosen to play, in that case, the main tuba player is playing a lower model, and a specialist plays this solo on a euphonium. Which, to all intents and purposes, is a tenor tuba and can play all of its parts and sound pretty much the way that composers intend whenever they mark tenor tuba in a part. And there really isn't a huge difference between the timbre of that euphonium and how it would sound on an F tuba anyways, or other model. But it's a real challenge if you are playing it on a big tuba, and YouTube actually does have a few videos on it of tuba players playing this on bigger models. In this case, there's a lovely arc to it, a wonderful kind of lumbering gracefulness. Especially as things get higher, there's a kind of plaintive urgency to it, which, if you've ever been raised around cows, you kind of recognize immediately. It is not only a great piece of music in its original form, as a piano score in describing an ox cart and some of the chaos and some of the heaviness and so on, but also in the way that it's orchestrated to describe that same thing. You can kind of hear the dirt and the clanging and everything else. And in fact, one of the things that Gordon Jacob admired the most about Henry Wood's orchestration of this, which, as you may remember, was about 6 years before Ravel's, was that offstage, Henry Wood had actually introduced the sound of cowbells sort of clattering around as the ox cart went by. And that's a fun touch, but I'm actually glad that Ravel didn't do this, because some things should actually be left to the viewer's imagination, right? So let's see what is stirred in your imagination as we listen to this played by the Thailand Philharmonic Orchestra and their euphonium soloist, and listen for all of those things that we talked about, noticing really that the accompaniment is very simply scored. And listen for that changeover from muted to normal strings, and maybe go and watch that recording of the Thailand Philharmonic Orchestra or any other orchestra, and if the camera is on the strings during these 11 bars, see how the players gradually remove their mutes. Also, as we're listening to this, watch out for those low harp notes and see if you can hear them. Before we break down the orchestration of this page, let's look at the dynamic arc here, because that's very revealing. Mezzo forte, sempre crescendo, so always getting louder. By the time we get to this point here, just before figure 40, forte crescendo. So everything really is pushing and pushing. And it's a very full tutti, even though we don't have heavy brass. Then poco diminuendo, and conductors like to really let this settle right back down to maybe around mezzo piano, mezzo forte, which makes this push right here enormous, especially as it is scored so big across all the instruments, right? Okay, so that's what's at play here. It's really all about that nuance that we've got here. Actually, nuance is kind of a strange way to refer to something that's very obvious, but it's nuanced all the same. So let's take a look right here at the harp. I would doubt whether or not the harp would be all that audible right in here. However, that's okay. The harpist is getting these chords because A, they will be heard right here at the beginning pretty well, and B, it's just nice for the harpist to be involved, right? It's similar to what we saw in Jupiter from the planets, that the harpists continue on even after their sound gets overwhelmed by the orchestra, just because that's a cool thing for them to do. It's entertaining for them as members of the orchestra. But after a while, Ravel doesn't waste their time, right? He's only giving them things that are in line with what they've done before, so they don't need to do all that much more practicing. And then they're going to come back here with these big, huge rolled chords, which have a better chance of being heard, but are still going to be a little bit nebulous in terms of balance. However, on these chords, you can see what's going on harmonically, right? So if you are getting a little lost by some of the transpositions of these instruments and some of the spread outness of the scoring here, with the violins and everybody else going to divisi, except for the double basses, then here's your guide to what's really going on, although some of this is stretched out. Remember that I mentioned before that this orchestration is pretty much a straight-up transcription. Ravel is keeping the registers of the instruments on the same general pitches as the piano score for the most part. Now here is where he broadens things out and builds things by octaves and adds things that weren't there before, like these repeating notes here in the lower strings, which we'll get to in a minute. So, yeah, this is world building by Ravel. This is adaptation. This isn't just straight up transcription. And there were quite a few other little spots here and there. But this is a whole passage where Ravel is just letting go and allowing the music to explode with excitement. And remember how we're also talking about Ravel following Rimsky-Korsakov's lead in terms of choice of instruments, approach, and so on and so forth. And here is another place where it's very much like what Rimsky-Korsakov would have orchestrated. So let's start with the melodic treatment, because that's the most straightforward. Here we've got just the outline of the melody in the oboes and first clarinet. However, the second violins are playing divisi in 4, and they're getting a chordal melody with the accompaniment of bassoon on the lowest note. So the first bassoon here is going to add some thickness to this chorale here by the second violins, and it's going to help underline it without having to necessarily double the top. Now the top is doubled quite firmly by the oboes, and as I said before, The oboes just basically play single beats without bothering with the eighth notes in between, and that gives this kind of a floating quality. This ba-da-da-da-da-da-da. Accompanying that, we have ba-ba-ba-ba, right? Because the overlapping of the sound as the violins move down creates a sense of richness and inertia. Two things that we really want to bring forward in depicting a huge cart drawn by a bunch of cows. Let's move on with our melodic analysis here. We see the same thing happening here, for the most part, with the flutes holding on to single beats in a kind of a game here with the oboes. All three oboes are playing three-part harmony an octave lower than the flutes. It's pretty much the same exact part. And this is where Ravel has obviously added this octave because Mussorgsky hasn't scored a third hand in his piano part. And the clarinet is going to pick up the game along with the bassoon and playing basically identical pitches. Remember, we're in A, so we're transposing up a third from the sounding pitches, right? So that would be an E. So we've got that doubling, and that is extremely thick. Bassoon in its tenor register and clarinet playing throat tones and upper chalumeau register. It's very, very thick sound. That is something that almost begs to be doubled by strings, so that the roughness of the wind doubling doesn't become too evident. And we've got that same row of pitches being played by the violas here. Meanwhile, the strings are just playing along with lots of tenuto bows. Now remember, a tenuto mark in strings means something quite different than it does on piano. It means to have a long, full bow on every note, and that gives just a soaring, cutting quality to the bow strokes. So things keep going on pretty much in this configuration for quite some way. And here, I really love how the arc of this is caught by the diminuendo. Then as things grow and get bigger, the melody line leaps up to this G sharp and just hammers its way down with down bows. Notice these triple stops here in the lower staff of the divisi first, and these are all pretty negotiable, these big triple stops. But it's going to further give a sort of jagged quality here, and very emphatic quality. So that is our melody stretched out across upper winds and upper strings. As to the bass, it's once again done in a very straightforward way. We've got octave contrabassoons and bassoon, along with bass clarinet and second clarinet. So this represents octaves with those little thirds in the middle that we can see here in the second divisi cellos. Here are C sharp, D sharp, E, F sharp, and so on. And that's being doubled by these single quarter notes in the lower clarinets. I love this sense of repeating here in the left hand. That's something that Ravel brought to it himself. That's not exactly the way the left hand is scored in the original. Yes, there are repeated eighth notes, but they're not done in exactly this particular voicing or this style. As the bass line continues on and the melody expands outwards, some of these voices are given up to the viola, and that's also a wise decision. And it's right around the time that the horns make their entrance here and present a big chordal interpretation of what is going on in the melody. And that also brings a huge amount of solidity to it, while keeping the timbre very dense and thick and dark. Notice as well that the horns back off as the dynamic drops down, and then they come back in strong in four-part harmony. Then we have got our bass line just chugging along here. Once again in double basses and cellos, this time on unison pitches, right? Underpinning these octaves here, also with second bassoon, contrabassoon dropping out along with the diminuendo. Then everybody coming back in extremely strong here at the end. This pizzicato touch here is very, very nice, I feel, and provides a great back and forth here. Ravel is setting up the next section where the timpani play in eighth notes, but he's going to do it by having this back and forth feeling here between the two drummers and, of course, those other single notes in the bass line. And something I have not really gotten to mentioning is just the whole rhythm right here that's being laid down here by the bass drum. Just single solid notes, keeping time. Here, double to quarter notes instead of once per bar. And then the excitement grows. Notice how actual dynamics are a little bit lacking here in the bass drum. And that's probably because Ravel wants the bass drum to find its place in terms of the hall, without necessarily giving it solid markings that line up with everybody else. So let's listen to this big tutti page here, and once again, just look at the simplicity of things, rather than getting overwhelmed by how complex everything looks. Look for the instruments that double and support each other, like the oboes and first clarinet and bassoon, helping out the second violins, and then how everything moves to three-part harmony spread out across two octaves, being doubled by upper winds, and then just the simplicity of the bass here, working its way across, and this lovely support by brass and the timekeeping of those lower percussion instruments. And if you can, maybe you can check in on how well the harp is doing and see how effective you feel that is. I tend to be really conservative in my harp scoring, in the sense that I just do not even bother scoring things like this. If I know the harpist is not going to be heard or has absolutely no chance of being heard, then I'll just leave their part out. There's a bit of an exception, though, if I am scoring something that has a chance of being recorded commercially. Then I may put in a harp part that could be overwhelmed if it weren't mic'd. So that's just an aesthetic decision, and I still try to score it in a way that the harp won't be wasted. Have a listen to this, and I'll see you on the next screen. Here at figure 42, we can see that Ravel is adding some great emphasis with the percussion, and yet he's pulling his punches. Forte on the bass drum, and then diminuendo al fine, so diminuendo until the end of the part, not necessarily the piece, because the end of the part may come well before the end of the piece. This very cool, sinister roll on the snare drum, which once again I feel contributes to a quality of stochastic resonance. As I mentioned in an earlier lecture in this series, referring to the same effect on a very prominent, long-lasting cymbal roll, was the quality of white noise, perhaps contributing to a brighter resonance in upper pitches that are scored above it. And as I mentioned before, we've got solid eighth notes playing through here on D sharps, then E's, and back and forth. And the tuba comes in just to warm up its embouchure a little bit here with these nice big notes here. And this might be a situation in which the main tuba player takes over these few bars and then just allows the euphonium player to play this note, if, once again, we have a euphonium soloist. But every other part in this passage is marked triple forte. And that's very cool. Here, once again, I do not feel that harp is going to be audible in normal situations. The harpist can be just plucking their guts out here and really make very little difference. And also, this is really low scoring. This could probably be handled just by the left hand, but it's a big reach on either side for the hands to get this low, especially if the harpist has sort of shorter arms. So, treatment of the melody, starting on this D sharp with all three flutes, 2 oboes, and, strangely, second violins instead of first violins. The second's taking the upper part for some reason. It's kind of nice to have them in the lead every once in a while. And maybe it's just some quality that Ravel wants to explore here. Perhaps the violinists who are facing away from the audience, if the violins were on either side of the conductor, would have a different discrete quality. But there's nothing discrete or subtle about this scoring. It is as obvious and in your face as possible. So that is the upper part of the melody. Then the lower part of the octave is played by third oboe, 2 clarinets, and first violins. Then there is yet a third octave below that. So essentially that was just the middle part that we looked at. And the third octave is being played by violas, along with bass clarinet and horns. So that's going to be very thick and soupy. Notice that there are places in which some instruments jump down, like for instance, first and second oboe are not asked to go all the way up to a high G sharp here. They jump down to G sharp at the top of the staff instead, but then fall back into line as soon as it becomes more humanly possible. And as things wend their way down here towards the end, we once again have poco diminuendo. So when things let off here, they're usually right around poco forte, mezzo forte, just a little under forte is where I would bring the orchestra, so that the bassoon family instruments here would feel strong by comparison to the melody slipping under them slightly, dynamically. But what you're really going to hear here are these A4 horns. That is just going to blast. It's going to be a huge, huge sound. And meanwhile, our bass is just thumping back and forth and pretty much covering the same notes as we saw at the beginning of the piece. The same exact strategy that we talked about before. Lower strings, plus bassoons, contrabassoon, and in this case, a little bit of tuba on top. Let's have a listen to that. We actually got through that really quickly, but as you saw, it's an extremely simple piece of orchestration, but nonetheless effective, right? And once again, see if you can make out the harp there, right? And think about making those kinds of decisions on your own. Is it cool to bring in the harp just for the harpist's benefit, so that they can feel part of the music? So that you can have just that added tiny little bit of tone weight at the very, very bottom, accompanying our low strings and bassoon family plus tuba. Does that make any difference whatsoever? And I will see you on the next screen. On this final screen, we can see how, having started this orchestration with the notion that the cart was approaching, allows Ravel to use the same strategies when the cart is departing, right? So he can strip back the accompaniment to very much like it was at the very beginning. We've got our bassoon family here doing pretty much the same thing that happened before. Here the D sharps are being underlined on each beat rather than a long pedal tone, but the effect is really the same. And of course we have the same tromping lower strings as before. The constant eighth notes of the timpani are giving way to that back and forth between timpani and bass drum again, and the snare drum gradually winds down. By the time we get to these little melodic notes, the percussion really starts to let go, until finally there's just a single bass drum hit on every bar, then 2 bars away, and then finally 4 bars away. Here's where I feel harp really comes into its own. It's not really going to be audible until right around here, but that's alright. You'll start to feel that longer plucking sustain, and especially here, these notes will come through really nicely, especially if the conductor has nicely balanced the orchestra. Notice here, we have the reverse of what happened before. Progressively add mutes, all the way to number 45. So each player is going to take a very quick break in succession and put on a mute. And it's a little tricky, but not necessarily all that hard, especially because there are any number of very simple mutes used nowadays that just sit on the strings between the bridge and the tailpiece and can be quickly moved into place, as opposed to having this sort of fork arrangement that you had to grab off the stand and then stick onto your bridge. So those are probably going to be used, and a lot of that just has to do with demands that composers put on the players like this. The mutes have to become simpler and simpler. I've seen some mutes that are basically just a rubber band, really, that the player can just quickly pull up and then hook over the bridge. But if it works, it works. Now that we've talked about all the accompaniment, let's talk about the melody. We're coming right back to tuba played over its very high register, or comfortable register for a euphonium. Take your pick. Then one last little firm note here, kicking off into the same notes as we see here, only played on muted first horn, so it has a very thinning effect. Then check this out. Remember that our bass clarinet is in A, right? So what note is this? Once again, same D sharp that we see right here, which to a degree has an even more thinning effect. So we hear that single melody note coming in the middle of a bar as everything dies away. And that's really a wonderful effect, I feel. This is very similar to what we've heard before, a masterpiece of simplicity. We see some of this very simple, effective, and yet beautifully craftsman-like approach in some of Ravel's other orchestrations, such as his orchestration of Ma Mère Roi, the Mother Goose Suite. That's a situation where the actual movements were orchestrated in a very plain, yet very beautifully crafted way. And then Ravel made a ballet arrangement of it, where he had little intermezzos in between each movement. And I think the order of one or two of the movements has been changed a little bit, so that it could be this beautiful child's ballet. And the orchestration of the intermezzos is actually quite flamboyant, very much in keeping with his approach back during the period that he was scoring Daphnis and Chloe, which was that time. And I feel that that approach of simplicity really stuck with him, so that around half a decade later, he was orchestrating his piano work, Le Tombeau de Couperin, which also had a simpler approach than his more flamboyant piano scoring. And the orchestration seemed to build on what he'd done with Ma Mère Loi. And we're seeing that here as well. That simpler approach. Not so impressionistic, but more simply programmatic, I would call it. In keeping with Rimsky-Korsakov, but of course with Ravel's own unique touches. So let's listen to that. Listen for all of those things. See if you can hear the harp slowly emerge from the texture. See if you can detect the mutes being slowly added here. Listen for the way that the percussion gradually diminishes. And also for the unique differences between these tone colors of euphonium, in the case of the recording we're using, then muted first trumpet, and then just a touch of bass clarinet at the end. And I'll see you in a couple of weeks for our next installment, another promenade, and then the dance of the chicks in their shells.